June 15, 1921. Le Crotoy, France, a small coastal town on the Bay of Somme. The sun is rising over the airfield. The wind smells like salt water and gasoline. A 29-year-old black woman from Texas stands next to a Newport 82 biplane, her hand resting on the wing fabric. Her name is Bessie Coleman, the daughter of sharecroppers, granddaughter of enslaved people. She's wearing a leather flight suit and goggles. In her other hand, she holds a piece of paper that will change aviation history forever. It's her pilot license, International Pilot License number 18,310, issued by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. She just became the first black woman in the world to earn a pilot license, the first Native American woman. And here's what they never taught you in school. She's the first American, regardless of race or gender, to earn an international pilot license directly from the FAI. Not the first black American. Not the first female American. The first American, period. While white American pilots were getting basic licenses through the National Aeronautic Association and then converting them, Bessie Coleman went straight to the international standard. She skipped the line. She went to the top. But here's the part that should make you furious. She had to cross an ocean to do it. She had to leave America. She had to learn a foreign language. She had to save money for 2 years working 2 jobs. Because in America, in 1920, not a single flight school would accept a black woman. Not one. Every single school she applied to said no. Some said, "We don't train women." Some said, "We don't train Negroes." Most said both. So she went to France. And she became the best. And when she came home, America barely noticed. The black newspapers celebrated her. The Chicago Defender ran front-page stories. But the white press barely a mention, a curiosity, a novelty, not a pioneer, not a trailblazer, just a black woman doing stunts. What happened next would change aviation forever. Bessie Coleman would become Queen Bess, the most famous barnstorming pilot in America. She would refuse to perform for segregated audiences. She would demand integration at every show. She would inspire a generation of black aviators, including the Tuskegee Airmen, who would prove black excellence in World War II. But they tried to keep her out of the sky. And when they couldn't stop her from flying, they made sure she couldn't survive. They sold her broken planes. They denied her financing. They refused her insurance. And in 1926, at the age of 34, Bessie Coleman died in a plane crash during a practice flight. The plane was a piece of junk, a surplus military trainer, poorly maintained. The only kind of aircraft black pilots could afford. Her dream was to open a flight school for black students. She never got the chance. But the doors she kicked open, the barriers, she shattered the legacy she built that lives forever. This is the story they buried. This is your stolen history. And after you hear it, you'll never see the aviation industry the same way again. You'll understand why there are so few black pilots today. You'll understand why aviation remains one of the whitest industries in America. You'll understand why your children never learned about Bessie Coleman in school. Because this isn't ancient history. Bessie died in 1926. Your great-grandparents were alive. Your grandparents heard stories about her. And the barriers she fought still exist today. Everything you learned about aviation history was sanitized. They taught you about the Wright brothers. They taught you about Charles Lindbergh. They taught you about Amelia Earhart. But they never taught you about Bessie Coleman, who earned her license 7 years before Amelia Earhart got hers. This isn't ancient history. This isn't a feel-good Black History Month story. This is a deliberate erasure. This is systematic suppression. This explains why your family doesn't own aircraft, why your cousin isn't an airline pilot, why the wealth gap in aviation is worse than almost any other industry. After this video, you'll know why Bessie Coleman had to go to France to learn what white Americans learned at home. You'll know why flight schools rejected her despite her qualifications. You'll know how her death at 34 wasn't just tragic, but preventable, caused by a system that denied black pilots access to safe aircraft. You'll know why her dream of opening a flight school for black students died, with her delaying black aviation development by decades. You'll know how her legacy inspired the Tuskegee Airmen, the all-black squadron that had to prove themselves in World War II, despite facing inferior equipment and racist commanders. And you'll never see a commercial airline pilot the same way again, because you'll know that industry was built on exclusion, that the 3% of airline pilots who are black today aren't 3%, because black people don't want to fly. They're 3% because the barriers Bessie Coleman faced in 1920 still exist in 2025. This isn't just about one woman who learned to fly. This is about a system designed to keep black people on the ground, literally and figuratively. This is about stolen opportunities that compound across generations. This is about your family's stolen wealth. Because if Bessie Coleman had lived and opened her flight school in 1926, if she had trained 10 students per year, by 1940, there would have been hundreds of black pilots instead of a handful. By 1960, there would have been thousands instead of dozens. Those pilots would have earned high salaries, built wealth, passed opportunities to their children. Your grandfather might have been a pilot. Your father might have been an airline captain. You might be in the aviation industry today, earning $200,000 a year. That opportunity was stolen when they sold Bessie Coleman a broken plane. That wealth was stolen when they denied black pilots financing and insurance. That legacy was stolen when they erased her from textbooks for 70 years. This is your stolen inheritance, and it's time to reclaim it. Not through violence, not through revenge, through truth, through education, through demanding what is owed, through making sure every black child knows Bessie Coleman's name before they learn about the Wright brothers. If your grandmother ever said a black woman has to be twice as brave, she was talking about Bessie Coleman. If your mother ever said, "Don't wait for white approval," she was channeling Bessie's spirit. If you've ever felt like you had to leave your community to find opportunity, you're walking in Bessie's footsteps. This is your history. This affects your life today. Let's begin. Ida Belle Coleman was not her birth name. The history books got that wrong too. Her name was Elizabeth Coleman. Born January 26, 1892 in Atlanta, Texas. Not Atlanta, Georgia, Atlanta, Texas. A small town in East Texas near the Louisiana border. Population maybe 2,000 people. Most of them poor. Most of them black. All of them trapped in the sharecropping system that replaced slavery with a different kind of bondage. Her mother was Susan Coleman. Her father was George Coleman. Both of them sharecroppers. George was of mixed black and Native American heritage, part Cherokee. Susan was black, born to enslaved parents. They had 13 children. Bessie was number 10. 10 out of 13. Think about that. A family of 13 children working cotton fields in East Texas in the 1890s. That was survival. That was America. George Coleman worked the fields. Susan Coleman cooked and cleaned and raised 13 children. The family lived in a one-room cabin on someone else's land. They picked someone else's cotton. They paid rent in crops. At the end of every year, the landowner would do the accounting, and somehow mysteriously the Coleman family never quite broke even. Always owed a little more. Always had to work another year to pay it off. That's how sharecropping worked. Slavery with extra steps. Bessie Coleman started picking cotton when she was old enough to walk. 4 years old, maybe 5, dragging a sack behind her in the Texas heat. 100 degrees in the summer. Her hands bleeding from the bowls. Her back aching from bending over. That was childhood for Bessie Coleman. But her mother, Susan, had a vision. Susan Coleman had been born enslaved. She never learned to read until after emancipation. And when she finally learned, she devoured the Bible. She read it cover to cover. She made a decision. Her children would be educated. Her children would read. Her children would have opportunities she never had. So Susan Coleman sent Bessie and her siblings to school. There was a one-room schoolhouse for black children 4 miles from their cabin. Bessie walked 8 miles round trip every day. 4 miles there, 4 miles back. In the heat, in the rain, in the cold. Because education was the only way out. Bessie Coleman was brilliant. Sharp mind, sharper determination. She read every book she could get her hands on. The school had maybe 20 books total. She read all of them, multiple times. She borrowed books from the church. She borrowed books from neighbors. She was hungry for knowledge, and she was good with numbers. Really good. By the time she was 6 years old, Bessie Coleman was managing the family finances. Susan would give her the money from selling eggs or vegetables, and Bessie would count it, budget and figure out how to stretch it through the week. 6 years old, and she was the family accountant. When she was 9, her father left. George Coleman had had enough of Texas, enough of sharecropping, enough of Jim Crow, enough of racism. He moved to Oklahoma, which had been designated Indian Territory. He thought maybe his Cherokee heritage would give him better opportunities there. He asked Susan to come with him. She refused. She wasn't leaving her community. She wasn't leaving her church. So George left without her. Susan Coleman was now a single mother, raising 13 children on a sharecropper's wages. It was impossible. The older kids had to work full-time. But Susan refused to let Bessie quit school. Bessie was the smart one. Bessie was going to make it. So Bessie kept walking 4 miles to school every day. Every year there was a problem. Cotton picking season. Late summer and fall. That's when the cotton is ready to harvest. That's when every hand is needed in the fields. The school would close because all the black children had to work. Bessie would miss months of school. Then she'd come back in the winter and have to catch up. But she always caught up. She always stayed ahead. She graduated from that one-room schoolhouse at the top of her class. And then she did something almost impossible for a black girl from a sharecropping family in 1907. She kept going. Bessie Coleman saved every penny she could. She worked as a laundress. She washed white people's clothes. She ironed white people's shirts. She saved her wages. And in 1910, when she was 18 years old, she enrolled at the Colored Agricultural and Normal University in Langston, Oklahoma. Today it's called Langston University. Back then it was one of the few colleges in America that accepted black students. Bessie made it 1 semester, 4 months. That's all the money she had saved. Tuition, room, board, books. By January 1911, she was broke. She had to drop out and go home. Think about what that must have felt like. You're 18 years old. You fought your way into college against impossible odds. You're finally getting the education you dreamed of. And then the money runs out. You have to go back to Texas, back to washing clothes, back to sharecropping life, back to dead-end futures. But Bessie Coleman didn't give up. She moved in with her older brother, Walter, in 1915. Walter had moved to Chicago during the Great Migration, that massive movement of black Americans from the South to the North, fleeing Jim Crow, fleeing lynching, fleeing poverty, looking for opportunity in industrial cities. Chicago was the promised land, or so they said. Bessie arrived in Chicago in 1915. She was 23 years old. She got a job at the White Sox barbershop on the South Side. She was a manicurist. She did nails for white businessmen. She was good at it. She made tips. She made friends. She started building a life. Chicago in 1915 was electric. It was the center of black culture. The Chicago Defender was the most important black newspaper in America. The South Side was bustling with black-owned businesses, black churches, black intellectual life. This was the new Negro movement, the Harlem Renaissance spreading to Chicago. Black people were building, creating, dreaming. And then World War I happened, 1914 to 1918. America entered the war in 1917. Black men enlisted. Bessie's brothers, John and Walter, both served in World War I. They went to France. They fought in the trenches. They came home with stories. And this is where Bessie Coleman's life changed forever. Because John and Walter came home talking about France, how different it was from America, how black soldiers were treated with respect, how French people didn't have the same racism as Americans, how French women were independent, modern, free. And here's the detail that lit a fire in Bessie's mind. French women were learning to fly planes. John Coleman liked to tease his little sister. He'd say, "French women are flying planes. French women are pilots. But you black women in America, you can't do anything. You'll never amount to anything. You'll be a manicurist forever." Bessie Coleman heard that and made a decision. She was going to learn to fly. She was going to become a pilot. She was going to prove her brother wrong. She was going to prove America wrong. It was 1919. Bessie Coleman was 27 years old. She was a manicurist in Chicago, and she decided she was going to become the first black female pilot in the world. But here's what she didn't know yet. Here's what would make her journey so much harder than she imagined. America didn't want black people to fly. Not black men, definitely not black women. And the system was designed to keep it that way. Bessie Coleman started applying to flight schools in 1919. She was methodical about it. She made a list of every aviation school in Chicago, then every school in Illinois, then every school in the Midwest. She wrote letters. She showed up in person. She explained her qualifications. She had a high school education, which was more than many white pilots had. She had business experience managing a salon. She was intelligent, determined, physically fit. Every single school said no. The first school she applied to was the Curtis Flying School. It was one of the most prestigious aviation schools in America, founded by Glenn Curtis, a pioneer in aircraft design. They had a location near Chicago. Bessie showed up. She filled out the application. She waited for a response. They didn't even send a rejection letter. They just never responded. She followed up. She called. She went back in person. Finally, someone told her the truth. "We don't train women. Policy. No exceptions." Bessie thought, okay, maybe that school is just old-fashioned. So she applied to another school. Same response. "We don't train women." She applied to a third school. This time, they were more direct. "We don't train colored people. And we definitely don't train colored women." She kept applying. School after school after school. Some schools said, "We don't train women." Some schools said, "We don't train Negroes." Some schools said both. Some schools didn't respond at all. But the answer was always no. Bessie Coleman applied to every flight school within 100 miles of Chicago. Every single one rejected her. She expanded her search. Ohio, Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin. Dozens of schools, hundreds of letters. Every single one said no. And here's what you need to understand. This wasn't because Bessie Coleman wasn't qualified. This wasn't because she couldn't pay. This wasn't because the schools were full. This was policy. Written or unwritten, every aviation school in America had a policy. No women, no Negroes, and absolutely no black women. Why? Because flying represented freedom. Flying represented power. Flying represented status. And America in 1920 was not about to let black people have any of those things, especially not black women. Think about the symbolism. A black woman in the sky, literally above white people, looking down on America from the clouds that couldn't be allowed. That was too radical, too threatening, too much. But Bessie Coleman didn't quit. She kept searching. And then she met the man who would change her life. Robert S. Abbott. Robert S. Abbott was the founder and publisher of the Chicago Defender, the most influential black newspaper in America. The Defender had a circulation of over 200,000 by 1920. It was distributed across the country. It was the voice of Black America. And Robert Abbott was a visionary. He believed in black excellence. He believed in proving white supremacy wrong. He believed in using the newspaper to showcase black achievement. Bessie Coleman was a regular customer at the barbershop, where Abbott got his haircut. She did manicures there. They started talking. She told him about her dream to become a pilot. She told him about the rejections, every school in America saying no. Abbott listened, and then he said something that changed everything. Go to France. France was different, Abbott explained. French people had seen black American soldiers fight in World War I. They'd seen black soldiers as heroes, not as inferiors. French culture was more open, more progressive, less hung up on American-style racism. And French flight schools were accepting women. Not a lot of women, but some. If Bessie went to France, if she learned French, if she applied to French schools, she might have a chance. Bessie Coleman took his advice seriously. She started making a plan. First, she needed to learn French. She enrolled in a night class at the Berlitz Language School in Chicago. She studied every evening after work. French grammar, French vocabulary, French pronunciation. It was hard. Really hard. Learning a foreign language as an adult while working full-time. But she did it. Second, she needed money. A lot of money. The trip to France alone would cost hundreds of dollars. That's thousands in today's money. Then there was tuition for flight school room and board living expenses. She needed to save at least $1,000, maybe $2,000. So Bessie Coleman worked 2 jobs. She kept her job as a manicurist during the day, and she took a second job managing a chili restaurant at night. She worked 16-hour days. She saved every penny. No new clothes, no entertainment, no luxuries. Every dollar went into a jar for France. Robert Abbott helped too. He wrote articles in the Chicago Defender about Bessie's dream. He organized fundraising events. He introduced Bessie to Jesse Binga, one of the wealthiest black men in Chicago, a banker who owned the Binga State Bank. Binga donated money toward Bessie's trip. Other black businessmen in Chicago contributed too. The community rallied around her. For a year and a half, Bessie Coleman studied French and saved money. 1919, 1920 into late 1920. She studied at night. She worked 2 jobs. She saved. She planned. She researched which flight schools in France might accept her. She wrote letters in French to schools in Paris, in Lyon, in Le Crotoy. She waited for responses. And finally, in November 1920, she had enough money. She had enough French. She had an acceptance letter from the École d'aviation des Frères Caudron, the Caudron brothers' School of Aviation, in Le Crotoy, France, a small town on the coast in northern France. They were willing to train her, not because she was black, not because she was a woman, but because she was qualified and could pay tuition. On November 20th, 1920, Bessie Coleman boarded a ship in New York Harbor. She was 28 years old. She had never left the United States. She was traveling alone. She had a suitcase, a few $100s, and a dream. She was crossing the Atlantic Ocean to learn how to fly. Think about the courage that took. It's 1920. You're a black woman from Texas. You've never been on a ship. You've never left America. You don't speak perfect French. You're going to a foreign country where you don't know anyone. You're going to spend every dollar you've saved on a dream that might not work out. The flight school might reject you. You might fail the training. You might die in a crash because learning to fly in 1920 was incredibly dangerous. Planes crashed all the time. Students died, but Bessie Coleman got on that ship anyway. Because staying in America meant accepting no. Staying in America meant working as a manicurist forever. Staying in America meant letting her brother be right, letting the system be right, letting white supremacy win. So she crossed the ocean. She arrived in France in early December 1920. She took a train from Paris to Le Crotoy, a fishing village on the Bay of Somme. It was cold. It was winter. The wind off the water was brutal. She checked into a boarding house. She reported to the aviation school. She started training. And here's what happened next. Here's what they never taught you in school. Bessie Coleman didn't just learn to fly. She excelled. She became one of the best students the Cadre School had ever seen. And in 7 months, she would earn a pilot license that put her ahead of almost every American pilot in the world. But before we get to that triumph, you need to understand what the training was like. Because it wasn't easy. It wasn't safe. And it required a level of courage that most people don't possess. The École d'Aviation des Frères Caudron was not a fancy school. It was a working flight school on a grass airfield next to the ocean. There were a few wooden buildings, a hangar, a classroom, a workshop where they repaired engines, and the planes. Old biplanes made of wood fabric and wire. Nieuport 82s mostly. Trainers left over from World War I. These were not safe aircraft. Understand that. Aviation in 1921 was incredibly dangerous. Planes crashed constantly. Engines failed. Wings tore off in strong winds. Control wires snapped. Pilots died regularly. This wasn't modern commercial aviation with safety regulations and backup systems. This was experimental flying. Every flight was a risk. Bessie Coleman knew that. She'd read about pilots dying. She'd seen the statistics. About 1 in every 100 student pilots died during training. 1 in 100. And she did it anyway. The Cadre School was run by 2 brothers, Gaston and René Cadre. They were famous in France. During World War I, the Cadre brothers had designed and built military aircraft for the French Air Force. After the war, they opened flight schools to train civilian pilots. They were serious, professional, demanding. They didn't care that Bessie was a woman. They didn't care that she was black. They cared whether she could fly. Bessie started with ground school. She had to learn aerodynamics, how wings generate lift, how control surfaces work, how engines function. She had to learn meteorology, how weather affects flying, how wind changes with altitude. She had to learn navigation, how to read maps from the air, how to find your way without GPS, without instruments, just visual landmarks. All of this was taught in French. Bessie's French was decent, but not perfect. She struggled at first. Technical vocabulary, aviation terms she'd never heard before. But she studied every night. She made flashcards. She asked questions. She worked harder than anyone else in the class. Then came the flying. The first time Bessie Coleman climbed into the cockpit of a Newport 82, her heart was pounding. The plane was small, open cockpit, 2 seats. The instructor sat in front. The student sat in back. There were dual controls. Both people had a stick and pedals. The instructor could take over at any moment. The engine was loud, really loud. It was a rotary engine, which means the entire engine spun around with the propeller. It roared like thunder. The smell of castor oil burned her nose. The plane shook and vibrated. And then they started rolling across the grass field faster and faster, and suddenly they were in the air. Bessie Coleman's first flight lasted about 15 minutes. The instructor flew. She just held the stick lightly, feeling how it moved, learning the sensations. The plane climbed to 1,000 feet. She could see the ocean. She could see the town below. She could see the world spread out like a map. And something inside her clicked. This was freedom. This was power. This was where she belonged. Over the next few months, Bessie trained intensively. She learned how to take off, how to land, which is harder than it sounds, how to turn without losing altitude, how to climb, how to descend, how to recover from a stall, which is when the plane loses lift and starts to fall, how to handle wind, how to handle rain, how to handle engine failure. The training was physically exhausting. Controlling a biplane in 1921 required strength. The control stick was heavy. You had to push and pull hard to move the control surfaces. The rudder pedals were stiff. Your legs would ache after an hour of flying, and the wind would batter you in the open cockpit. Your face would freeze in the cold. Your hands would cramp. But Bessie Coleman loved every second of it. She was flying. She was in the sky. She was doing something no black woman in the world had ever done. Her instructors were impressed. She learned fast. She had natural ability. She was fearless but not reckless. She knew when to push and when to be cautious. After a few weeks, they let her solo. That's when you fly the plane alone for the first time. No instructor. Just you and the plane and the sky. Bessie Coleman's first solo flight was in March 1921. She took off from the grass strip at Le Crotoy, climbed to 2,000 feet, flew a circuit around the field, and landed safely. When she climbed out of the cockpit, she was grinning so wide her face hurt. She'd done it. She'd flown solo. Over the next 3 months, she accumulated flight hours. She practiced maneuvers. She learned how to do steep turns, figure eights emergency landings. The cadre instructors pushed her hard. They wanted to make sure she was truly competent, not just barely passable. And then came the test. To earn a license from the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale, you had to pass both a written exam and a practical flight test. The written exam covered aerodynamics, navigation, meteorology, aircraft systems, emergency procedures. It was in French. Bessie studied for weeks. She took the exam in early June 1921. She passed. Then came the flight test. She had to demonstrate all the skills she'd learned. Takeoffs, landings, turns, stalls, navigation. An examiner flew with her, watching everything, grading every maneuver. Bessie flew perfectly. She nailed every requirement. The examiner signed off. On June 15, 1921, Bessie Coleman was issued International Pilot License Number 18,310 by the Fédération Aéronautique Internationale. She was officially a licensed pilot. Let me say that again so you understand the magnitude. June 15, 1921. Bessie Coleman became the first black woman in the world to earn a pilot license, the first Native American woman to earn a pilot license, and the first American of any race or gender to earn an international pilot license directly from the FAI. Most American pilots at that time were getting basic licenses from the National Aeronautic Association, a U.S. organization, and then converting those to international licenses later. Bessie Coleman skipped that step. She went straight to the international standard. She went straight to the top. The French newspapers covered her achievement. They called her the first woman of color to earn a pilot license. They celebrated her courage, her determination. The aviation community in France respected her. She'd earned it. But back in America, the reaction was mixed. The Chicago Defender ran a front-page story. Black woman aviatrix returns from France. The black press celebrated. Churches held services thanking God for Bessie's achievement. Black communities across the country were inspired. Finally, a black woman showing the world what was possible, but the white press barely noticed. The New York Times ran a tiny paragraph buried on page 20. White aviation magazines ignored her completely. Why? Because acknowledging Bessie Coleman meant acknowledging that a black woman had accomplished something white Americans hadn't. It meant admitting that the barriers keeping black people out of aviation were unjust. It meant confronting the lie that black people were inferior. So they ignored her. They minimized her. They hoped she would fade into obscurity. Bessie Coleman had other plans. She was just getting started. But she knew one license wasn't enough. If she wanted to make a living as a pilot, if she wanted to open a flight school, if she wanted to inspire others, she needed more training. She needed to learn advanced flying, aerobatics, stunts, the kinds of skills that would make crowds cheer. So in early 1922, Bessie Coleman went back to Europe. She went to Paris and trained with advanced instructors. She learned loops, barrel rolls, spins. She went to Germany and trained with former World War I fighter pilots. She went to the Netherlands and trained with the chief pilot of the Fokker Aircraft Company. She was becoming an expert, not just a pilot, a stunt pilot, a barnstormer. Barnstorming was the business model for pilots in the 1920s. You traveled around the country putting on aerial shows. You'd fly over a town, do some stunts to get people's attention, then land in a farmer's field and charge people to watch you perform. Loops, rolls, dives, wing, walking parachute jumps. It was part circus, part daredevil act, part advertising for the future of aviation. Bessie Coleman decided that's what she would do. She would become a barnstorming pilot. She would travel across America putting on shows. She would use her fame to inspire black people. She would save money and eventually open a flight school for black students. That was the plan. In September 1922, Bessie Coleman returned to America. She was ready. She had an international pilot license. She had advanced training. She had experience. And she was about to make history again. On September 3, 1922, Bessie Coleman performed her first public flight in America. It was at Curtiss Field in Long Island, New York, the same Curtiss flying school that had rejected her application just 3 years earlier. She flew over their heads. She did stunts. She proved them wrong. Then on October 15, 1922, Bessie Coleman performed in Chicago, her hometown, the place where she'd worked as a manicurist, where she'd saved every penny, where she'd dreamed of flying, while white men told her it was impossible. She flew at Checkerboard Field in front of over 2,000 people, black and white, all cheering for Queen Bess. That's what they started calling her. Queen Bess. Brave Bessie. The newspapers loved the nicknames, and Bessie Coleman embraced them. She wore a military-style uniform. She walked with confidence. She smiled for photographs. She gave interviews. She was becoming famous. But here's what made Bessie Coleman different from every other barnstorming pilot. She refused to perform for segregated audiences. Every time a promoter tried to book her for a whites-only show, she said no. Every time they wanted to make black people enter through a separate gate or sit in a separate section, she refused. She demanded integration. At every single show. In the South, this was radical. This was dangerous. In 1922, segregation was the law. Jim Crow ruled. Whites and blacks didn't mix. But Bessie Coleman said, if you want me to fly, everybody enters through the same gate. Everybody sits together. Everybody gets treated equally. Take it or leave it. And you know what? They took it. Because people wanted to see her fly. White people and black people both. She was that good. She was that famous. So they integrated the shows. Temporarily. Just for her. Just for that day. But it happened. Bessie Coleman used her star power to force integration, even if only for a few hours at a time. She said something once that should be written on every wall in every school in America. She said, "The air is the only place free from prejudice." I knew we had no aviators, and I knew the race needed to be represented. Read that again. I knew the race needed to be represented. She wasn't flying for herself. She was flying for every black person in America. She was proving that black people could do anything white people could do. She was opening doors. She was inspiring the next generation. And it worked. Young black kids would come to her shows and see this black woman in the sky. doing things that seemed impossible. Loops and rolls and dives. And they would think, if she can do that, maybe I can too. Maybe I can be a pilot. Maybe I can be an engineer. Maybe I can be whatever I want. Bessie Coleman performed all over America. Memphis, Texas, California, Georgia, Ohio, Florida. Everywhere she went, crowds came. Thousands of people. The black press covered every show. But Bessie had a bigger dream. She wanted to open a flight school. She wanted to train the next generation of black pilots. She started saving money. She started making plans. But she needed a plane. Her own plane. She'd been borrowing planes or renting them for shows. That was expensive and risky. She needed to buy her own aircraft. But here's the problem. Banks wouldn't give her a loan. Black woman trying to buy an airplane in 1922. No bank would touch that. Insurance companies wouldn't insure her. They said women pilots were too risky. Black pilots were too risky. They refused. So Bessie could only afford cheap planes. Surplus military aircraft. Old trainers from World War I. Poorly maintained. Dangerous. But that's all she could get. And that's what killed her. April 30th, 1926, Jacksonville, Florida. Bessie Coleman was preparing for a big show. It was going to be a benefit for the Negro Welfare League. The next day, May 1st, she was scheduled to perform. But she wanted to scout the area first. She wanted to figure out where to do her parachute jump, make sure the landing zone was clear. So on April 30th, the day before the show, she went up for a practice flight. She wasn't even piloting. She was in the back seat. Her mechanic, William Wills, was flying. They were in a Curtiss JN-4 called a Jenny. It was an old World War I trainer. Bessie had bought it for $400. That's how cheap it was. $400 for an airplane. That should tell you something. They took off from Paxson Field around 7:30 in the evening. They climbed to 3,000 feet. Bessie was leaning over the side of the cockpit looking down, planning her parachute jump. She wasn't wearing a seatbelt. She needed to be able to lean out and see clearly. And then something went wrong. A wrench had been left in the engine compartment. During the flight, it came loose. It got caught in the control gears. The controls jammed. William Wills couldn't move the stick. The plane went into a dive. Then it flipped upside down. Bessie Coleman, not wearing a seatbelt, was thrown from the plane. She fell 3,000 feet. She died instantly when she hit the ground. William Wills tried to regain control. He couldn't. The plane was in a spin. It crashed nose first into the ground. Wills died in the wreckage. The plane exploded. Both of them were gone. Bessie Coleman was 34 years old. She had been flying for 5 years. She had inspired thousands. She was about to open her flight school. And she died because someone left a wrench in the engine and because she couldn't afford a safe plane. The investigation ruled it mechanical failure due to improper maintenance. But no one was held accountable. The person who sold her that $400 death trap. No consequences. The mechanic who failed to check the plane properly. He died in the crash too, so no trial. Just an accident. Just bad luck. That's how they framed it. But it wasn't bad luck. It was systemic. Bessie Coleman died because black pilots were denied financing, denied insurance, forced to buy junk aircraft. And when those aircraft failed, they were blamed for taking risks. They called her a daredevil. They said barnstorming was inherently dangerous. They made it sound like it was her fault for being reckless. But the truth is, Bessie Coleman died because America refused to give her the resources to fly safely. They wouldn't train her. They wouldn't finance her. They wouldn't insure her. They wouldn't sell her a decent plane. And when she died in the junk plane they forced her to buy, they shrugged and said, "Well, flying is dangerous." Bessie Coleman's funeral was held in Chicago on May 7th, 1926. Over 5,000 people attended. The streets were packed. The Chicago Defender called her a heroine. Churches held memorial services. Black communities across America mourned. She was a hero, a pioneer, a trailblazer, and then America forgot about her. For 70 years, Bessie Coleman was erased from history, from textbooks, from aviation museums, from the national conversation. Why? Because she was too radical. She refused to accept segregation. She spoke out against discrimination. She was bold and confident and unwilling to wait for white approval. So they erased her. They wrote her out of the story. They made sure your grandparents never learned her name in school. They made sure your parents never saw her in a history book. They made sure you grew up thinking the first woman pilot was Amelia Earhart, who didn't get her license until 1928, 7 years after Bessie Coleman. But here's what they couldn't erase: the legacy, the inspiration, the doors Bessie Coleman kicked open. Because even though she died at 34, even though her flight school never opened, she inspired a generation of black aviators. And that generation changed history. Do you see the pattern? Bessie Coleman wasn't the only one. She wasn't an isolated case of discrimination. This was systematic. This was policy. This was America deliberately keeping black people out of aviation. And it didn't stop with Bessie. It continued for decades. Let me show you. After Bessie died in 1926, other black Americans tried to follow her path. They tried to become pilots. They tried to enter aviation. And every single one of them faced the exact same barriers Bessie had faced. The same rejections, the same closed doors, the same systematic exclusion. Let me tell you about some of them. Names you've never heard. Stories that were buried just like Bessie's. Cornelius Coffey was born in 1903 in Arkansas. He moved to Chicago during the Great Migration. He fell in love with aviation after seeing Bessie Coleman perform. He decided he wanted to be a pilot too. He applied to aviation schools. Every single one rejected him. We don't train colored people. So Cornelius Coffey taught himself. He bought books on aircraft mechanics. He studied engines. He learned by doing. He became a mechanic first, then a pilot. In 1932, he earned his pilot license. But here's what makes his story remarkable. He became the first black person to earn an aircraft mechanic license in America. Not just a pilot license, a mechanic license. That meant he could legally work on aircraft, inspect them, certify them as airworthy. White aviation companies wouldn't hire him. We don't employ Negroes. So Cornelius Coffey opened his own business. And in 1939, he and his wife, Willa Brown, opened the Coffey School of Aeronautics near Chicago. The first black-owned flight school in America. The school Bessie Coleman had dreamed of opening. Cornelius Coffey made it happen 13 years after Bessie died. Now let me tell you about Willa Brown. Born 1906 in Kentucky. Brilliant student. Got a college degree, which was rare for a black woman in the 1920s. She became a teacher. But she wanted to fly. She applied to aviation schools. Rejected. We don't train women. We don't train colored people. So she found a private instructor who agreed to teach her. She earned her pilot license in 1938. Then she earned her commercial license in 1943. She became one of the first black women in America to hold a commercial pilot license. But the airlines wouldn't hire her. No airline in America employed black pilots, male or female. So Willa Brown did something else. She became a flight instructor. She co-founded the Coffey School with her husband. And here's the impact. That school trained over 200 black pilots who would go on to become Tuskegee Airmen. 200. Willa Brown personally trained them. Without her, the Tuskegee Airmen program might not have succeeded. Janet Harmon Bragg, born 1907 in Georgia, studied nursing, moved to Chicago, saw Bessie Coleman perform, and decided she wanted to fly. Applied to aviation schools, rejected. So she found a private instructor. earned her private pilot license in 1933. Then her commercial license in 1943. She tried to get a job as a commercial pilot. Every airline said no. So she helped co-found the Challenger Air Pilots Association, an organization for black aviators in Chicago. She helped train future Tuskegee Airmen candidates. She used her own money to help black students pay for flight training. Do you see it? Every single black person who succeeded in aviation faced the exact same pattern of rejection. Flight schools said no. Airlines said no. The industry said no. So they found alternative paths. They taught themselves. They learned from private instructors. They went to Europe like Bessie did. They opened their own schools. They created their own opportunities. And then they turned around and helped the next generation. That's not a coincidence. That's not individual racism. That's systematic exclusion. That's institutional policy designed to keep black people out of aviation. And it wasn't just civilian aviation. The military was even worse. Let me show you the numbers, and they're going to make you furious. World War I, 1914 to 1918. America trained thousands of pilots for military service. Thousands of white men learned to fly at government expense. They became heroes. They became aces. They came home to parades and medals and respect. How many black pilots did the U.S. military train during World War I? Zero. Not one. The military had a policy. No Negro pilots. Black men could serve in the army. They could fight in the trenches. They could die for America. But they couldn't fly. Eugene Bullard was a black American who wanted to fly. He tried to join the U.S. military aviation program. Rejected. So he went to France and joined the French military. He became a fighter pilot in the French Air Force. He flew combat missions. He shot down enemy planes. He was a war hero. In France. But when the war ended and he came back to America, the U.S. military refused to recognize his service. They refused to let him fly for America. They said his French pilot license didn't count. He spent the rest of his life working as an elevator operator in New York, a combat pilot, a war hero, operating an elevator, because America refused to let a black man fly American planes. Between the wars 1920 to 1940, the U.S. military continued its policy. No black pilots, not one. They trained thousands more white pilots, but zero black pilots. The policy was explicit, written in military regulations. Negroes are not qualified for aviation duty, not qualified. That was the official language. As if being black somehow made you physically unable to fly a plane. As if melanin affected your ability to operate controls. It was pseudoscience. It was racism dressed up as policy. Black leaders protested. The Untold ACP lobbied Congress. Black newspapers ran campaigns demanding integration of military aviation. The Chicago Defender, the Pittsburgh Courier. Every major black newspaper in America called for change. And the military said no. Year after year. No. Then World War II started. 1939 in Europe. 1941 for America after Pearl Harbor. Suddenly, America needed pilots. Lots of pilots. The war was massive. The air war was crucial. And there weren't enough white pilots to fill all the positions. Black leaders saw an opportunity. They increased pressure. Eleanor Roosevelt, the First Lady, supported the cause. She even flew with a black pilot, C. Alfred Anderson, to prove that black people could fly competently. Black newspapers intensified their campaigns. Black voters made it clear this was a priority. Finally, in 1941, the military gave in. Not because they believed black people were qualified, but because they needed more pilots, and the political pressure was too intense. They created a segregated program, the Tuskegee Airmen Program. Named after Tuskegee Institute in Alabama, where the training took place. Let me be clear about something. The Tuskegee Airmen Program was not a gift. It was not generosity. It was not progress. It was the absolute minimum the military could do under intense political pressure. And even then, they set it up to fail. They gave the black pilots inferior equipment. They assigned racist commanders who didn't want them to succeed. They created extra barriers that white pilots didn't face. They were testing black pilots to a higher standard, hoping they would fail, so the military could say, "See, we tried, but Negroes just can't do it." But the Tuskegee Airmen didn't fail. They excelled. They became one of the most successful fighter squadrons in World War II. They flew over 1,500 combat missions. They escorted bombers deep into enemy territory. They protected those bombers so effectively that the white bomber crews requested them specifically. They earned over 150 distinguished flying crosses. They shot down enemy planes. They destroyed enemy targets. They proved beyond any doubt that black pilots were just as skilled, just as brave, just as capable as white pilots. And you know what inspired many of those Tuskegee Airmen Bessie Coleman? They'd heard stories about her. They'd read about her in black newspapers. They knew that a black woman had conquered the sky 20 years earlier when America said it was impossible. If she could do it, so could they. The first class of Tuskegee Airmen began training in 1941. That's 20 years after Bessie Coleman earned her license. 20 years. Bessie proved black people could fly in 1921, but America still refused to train black military pilots until 1941. Well, because they didn't want black people to have that power. Flying meant freedom. Flying meant status. Flying meant authority. And America was not ready to give black people any of those things. From 1941 to 1946, the Tuskegee program trained 992 black pilots, just under 1,000. In that same time period, the military trained tens of thousands of white pilots. The disparity is staggering. And even after proving themselves in combat, after the war ended, most Tuskegee Airmen couldn't get jobs as commercial pilots. The airlines still wouldn't hire black pilots. So these war heroes, these combat veterans, these men who had flown missions over Europe and risked their lives for America, came home and couldn't get hired to fly commercial planes. It wasn't until 1963 that a major U.S. airline hired its first black pilot. 1963. His name was Marlon D. Green. He was a Tuskegee Airman. He'd served his country. He applied to Continental Airlines. They rejected him. So he sued. He took Continental Airlines to court. He fought for years. And finally, in 1963, the courts ordered Continental to hire him. He became the first black commercial airline pilot in America. Not because the airline wanted to hire him, because a court forced them to. Think about that timeline. Bessie Coleman earned her pilot license in 1921. The Tuskegee Airmen proved black excellence in aviation from 1941 to 1946. But it still took until 1963 for an airline to hire a black pilot. 42 years after Bessie. That's not slow progress. That's systematic exclusion. That's deliberate policy to keep black people out of one of the highest paying, most prestigious careers in America. Now let me show you the numbers today, and you're going to see that the pattern still continues. Right now, in 2025, there are approximately 160,000 commercial airline pilots in the United States today. How many of them are black? 3%. Less than 5,000. 3%. Black Americans are 13% of the population, but only 3% of pilots. Why is it because black people don't want to fly? No. Is it because black people aren't qualified? No. It's because the barriers Bessie Coleman faced in 1920 still exist today. They just look different. Here's how it works now. To become a commercial airline pilot, you need thousands of hours of flight training. You need a private pilot license, an instrument rating, a commercial license, a multi-engine rating, an airline transport pilot certificate. All of that costs between $80,000 and $150,000. That's the minimum. Some people spend $200,000 on flight training before they can get hired by an airline. How many families can afford that? The median white household in America has a net worth of $188,000. The median black household has a net worth of $24,000. Read those numbers again. White families on average have $188,000 in wealth. Black families on average have $24,000. That's an 8-to-1 ratio. That wealth gap is the direct result of centuries of theft, slavery, sharecropping, lynching, the destruction of Black Wall Street, redlining. All of that stolen wealth compounds across generations. So when a white kid says, "I want to be a pilot," the family can often afford to pay for flight school, or they can co-sign a loan, or they can provide a financial safety net. When a black kid says, "I want to be a pilot," most black families can't afford it. They can't co-sign a $100,000 loan. They don't have generational wealth to fall back on. So the dream dies before it starts. That's not a failure of ambition. That's systematic exclusion through economic barriers. And it's deliberate. They don't have to say, "We don't train black people anymore." They just make it so expensive that most black people can't afford it. The effect is the same: exclusion. But now they can say, "Well, it's not discrimination, it's just economics." Anyone who can pay can get trained, except the reason black people can't pay is because of discrimination, because their ancestors were enslaved, because their great-grandparents were sharecroppers, because their grandparents were blocked from buying homes through redlining, because their parents were denied business loans, because black wealth was systematically stolen across generations. So saying, "It's just economics," is a lie. It's racism hidden behind a dollar sign. And even when black people do make it through flight training, even when they beat the odds and earn their licenses, they still face discrimination. Studies have shown that job applications with traditionally black-sounding names get fewer callbacks for pilot positions than identical applications with white-sounding names. Same qualifications, same experience, different name, different response. That's racism. In 2025, black pilots report being questioned by passengers. "Are you really the pilot? Do you know what you're doing?" White passengers assuming a black person in a pilot uniform must be a mistake. That doesn't happen to white pilots. That's racism. Black pilots report hostile work environments, colleagues making racist jokes, being passed over for promotions, being given less desirable routes. That's racism. And here's the kicker. When black pilots speak up about this discrimination, they're told they're being too sensitive. They're playing the race card. They're making it about race when it's really about qualifications. Except it's always been about race. Since Bessie Coleman in 1920. Since the Tuskegee Airmen in 1941. Since Marlin Green in 1963. It's always been about keeping black people out of the cockpit. Pause for a second. Think about what this means for your family. If Bessie Coleman had lived, if she'd opened her flight school in 1926, if she'd trained 10 students a year for the next 20 years, that's 200 black pilots by 1946. Those pilots could have opened more schools. They could have trained thousands more. By 1960, there could have been a whole industry of black-owned flight schools, black pilots, black aviation businesses, generational wealth, high-paying careers, status, power. Your great-grandfather could have been one of those pilots, could have earned a high salary, could have bought a home invested in property-built wealth. Your grandfather could have inherited that wealth, expanded it, passed it to your father. Your father could have passed it to you. You could be in the aviation industry today, earning 6 figures. Your family could be wealthy. That opportunity was stolen when they sold Bessie Coleman a $400 death trap. That wealth was stolen when they denied black pilots financing and insurance and safe aircraft. That future was stolen when they erased her from history and made sure your grandparents never learned her name. This isn't ancient history. This is your stolen inheritance. This explains why your family rents instead of owns. Why you're struggling financially, while white families who got into aviation in the 1920s and 30s have generational wealth. They didn't work harder. They didn't deserve it more. They just weren't systematically excluded the way your ancestors were. And it's still happening. Right now. Black kids who dream of being pilots but can't afford flight school. That's the theft continuing. Black pilots facing discrimination in hiring and promotion. That's the theft continuing. Black families locked out of the wealth that aviation careers create. That's the theft continuing. The pattern is clear. From Bessie Coleman in 1920 to today, in 2025, America has systematically excluded black people from aviation. The methods changed. First, it was explicit. We don't train Negroes. Then it was structural. We'll train you separately and give you inferior resources. Now it's economic. We'll make it so expensive you can't afford it. But the goal has always been the same. Keep black people out of the sky. Keep black people from that freedom, that power, that wealth. But here's what they couldn't stop. Here's what they couldn't erase. The legacy, the inspiration. Every black kid who sees a black pilot and thinks I could do that. Every black family that pushes their children toward aviation, despite the barriers. Every organization working to provide scholarships for black aviation students. Every black pilot flying today despite the discrimination. That's Bessie Coleman's legacy. That's what they couldn't kill. Now let me show you how they tried to bury this history. How they made sure you never learned any of this in school. How they erased Bessie Coleman and the Tuskegee Airmen and all the other black aviation pioneers from the textbooks. Because it wasn't an accident. It was deliberate. And the cover-up is almost as evil as the original crime. Think about your education. How many years did you spend in school? 12 years of elementary, middle, and high school. Maybe 4 years of college. In all those years, how many times did a teacher mention Bessie Coleman? I'm guessing never. How many times did a textbook include her story? Probably never. Maybe you learned about the Wright brothers. Maybe you learned about Amelia Earhart. Maybe you even learned about Charles Lindbergh. But Bessie Coleman, the first black woman pilot, the first American to earn an international pilot license. Nothing. Silence. Erasure. That wasn't an accident. That was policy. Let me show you how it worked. After Bessie died in 1926, the black community tried to keep her memory alive. The Challenger Air Pilots Association in Chicago organized annual memorial flights on the anniversary of her death. They'd fly over her grave and drop flowers. Black newspapers wrote about her every year. Churches included her in their histories. The black community remembered. But the white establishment buried her. When history textbooks were written in the 1930s, 40s, 50s, Bessie Coleman wasn't included. The publishers made a choice. We're going to write about aviation history. We're going to mention the Wright brothers, of course. We'll include some white male pilots who set records. We'll include Amelia Earhart because she's a woman, and that's interesting. But Bessie Coleman, no. Not important enough. Not significant enough. Not relevant. Why? Because including Bessie Coleman would mean admitting that a black woman achieved something remarkable. It would mean admitting that the barriers keeping black people out of aviation were unjust. It would mean questioning why America rejected her. It would mean confronting racism. So they left her out. They pretended she never existed. Generation after generation of American students learned about aviation history, with Bessie Coleman erased. The same thing happened with the Tuskegee Airmen. After World War II ended, history books talked about the war. They talked about battles and generals and victories. They talked about white fighter pilots and bomber crews. But the Tuskegee Airmen barely mentioned. Maybe a footnote, maybe a single sentence. They were America's most successful fighter squadron, but the textbooks treated them like they didn't matter. Why? Because including the Tuskegee Airmen would mean admitting that the military segregated them. It would mean admitting that black pilots had to prove themselves under conditions white pilots never faced. It would mean admitting that even after they proved their excellence, they still couldn't get jobs with airlines. It would mean confronting the uncomfortable truth that America discriminated against its own war heroes because they were black. So the textbooks left them out. This happened in every state, North and South. It wasn't just Southern states trying to hide their racist history. Northern states did it too. New York textbooks didn't mention Bessie Coleman. California textbooks didn't mention Bessie Coleman. Illinois textbooks in her home state where she lived and worked and became famous didn't mention Bessie Coleman. This was a national erasure, a coordinated effort to make sure white America never had to confront what had been done to black aviators. And it worked, for 70 years. From 1926, when Bessie died, until the 1990s, most Americans had never heard of Bessie Coleman. 3 generations, your great-grandparents, your grandparents, your parents. They all grew up never learning her name, never knowing her story, never understanding what had been stolen from black Americans in aviation. It wasn't until the 1990s that things started to change. Black historians started pushing for inclusion. Educators started demanding more complete history. Publishers slowly, reluctantly started adding a paragraph here and there about Bessie Coleman and the Tuskegee Airmen. But even now, in 2025, most textbooks give them minimal coverage. A paragraph? Maybe a picture. Nothing that captures the full scope of their achievements or the full injustice of what they faced. Your children are probably learning more about the Wright brothers in 1 week than they'll learn about Bessie Coleman in their entire education. That's not because the Wright brothers were more important. It's because the curriculum is designed to center white achievement and minimize black achievement. And it's not just textbooks. Aviation museums did the same thing. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum in Washington, D.C. is the most visited museum in America. Millions of people walk through it every year. For decades, Bessie Coleman was barely mentioned. No major exhibit, no prominent display. Meanwhile, white pilots got whole galleries. The museum made a choice. We're going to celebrate these white aviators as pioneers. And we're going to mostly ignore the black woman who earned an international license before most of them. It took until the 21st century for that to start changing. Now there's some recognition. But for most of the museum's history, Bessie Coleman was erased. Same with other aviation museums across the country. The Museum of Flight in Seattle, the Pima Air and Space Museum in Arizona, the museum at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. All of them centered white achievement and marginalized black achievement. Why? Because museums are not neutral. They make choices about what to include and what to exclude. And for decades, they chose to exclude black aviation pioneers. They chose to tell a story of aviation history that was almost entirely white. They chose to make it seem like aviation was a white man's achievement, with maybe a white woman or two. They erased the black pilots, the black mechanics, the black engineers, the black innovators who contributed to aviation, despite being systematically excluded from the industry. The media did the same thing. When aviation shows aired on television, when documentaries were made about flight history, when magazines ran features about famous pilots, they almost always focused on white aviators. Bessie Coleman was ignored. The Tuskegee Airmen were barely mentioned. The message was clear. Aviation is a white space. Black people don't belong here. Even when the media did cover black aviators, they framed it wrong. They called Bessie Coleman a daredevil, a stunt pilot, a novelty act. They didn't call her what she was: a pioneer, a trailblazer, a skilled aviator. They diminished her. They made it sound like she was entertainment, not a serious contribution to aviation. Compare that to how they wrote about white male pilots. They called them aces, heroes, legends. They used respectful, admiring language. But for Bessie, daredevil, as if she was reckless, as if her flying was a circus act instead of a professional achievement. When they covered the Tuskegee Airmen, they often focused on the racism they faced instead of their achievements. They'd say, here are these black pilots who overcame discrimination. Which is true. But by focusing only on the discrimination, they made it seem like the story was about suffering instead of excellence. The Tuskegee Airmen weren't just victims of racism who managed to fly anyway. They were exceptional pilots who excelled at the highest level of combat aviation. They earned medals. They won battles. They protected American bombers. That should be the headline. Their excellence. Not just their suffering. But the media framed it as a feel-good story about overcoming obstacles. And by doing that, they avoided asking the hard questions. Why were they facing those obstacles? Who created those barriers? What was stolen from black Americans by excluding them from aviation for decades? Those questions make white America uncomfortable. So the media didn't ask them. They told sanitized stories that made white audiences feel okay about history instead of confronting the full truth. And let me tell you something that's going to make you angry. After Bessie Coleman died, after she sacrificed everything to open doors for black aviators, do you know what some black leaders did? They tried to bury her too. Not all of them, but some. The respectable ones. The ones who thought black progress meant being patient and polite, and not making white people uncomfortable. Bessie Coleman was too radical for them. She refused to perform for segregated audiences. She spoke out against discrimination. She was bold and confident, and unwilling to wait for white approval. Some black leaders thought that was too much. They thought it made the race look bad. They thought black people should be more patient, more humble, more willing to accept gradual progress. So when it came time to preserve her legacy, some of those leaders didn't fight hard enough. They didn't push for her to be included in textbooks. They didn't demand that aviation museums honor her. They moved on to other heroes, more acceptable heroes. Black men who were patient and diplomatic. People like Booker T. Washington, who preached accommodation. People like George Washington Carver, who wasn't threatening to white power structures. Bessie Coleman was too independent, too bold, too unwilling to compromise. So even some black institutions let her memory fade. It wasn't until later, generations, more radical generations, the civil rights generation, and beyond that, black historians and activists started fighting to restore her place in history. But by then, decades had passed. Generations had grown up never hearing her name. The damage was done. And here's the cruelest part. While Bessie Coleman was being erased from history, white aviators who accomplished less than her were being celebrated and memorialized and turned into legends. Amelia Earhart got movies, books, endless coverage. And yes, Amelia Earhart was brave and accomplished. I'm not diminishing her. But she got her pilot license in 1928, 7 years after Bessie Coleman. And Amelia Earhart became a household name, while Bessie Coleman was forgotten. What because America chose to remember the white woman and forget the black woman. Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic solo in 1927 and became the most famous pilot in the world. parades, magazine covers, hero worship. Meanwhile, Bessie Coleman, who crossed the Atlantic 7 years earlier in 1920, who earned a more advanced license than Lindbergh had when he made his famous flight, was forgotten. Why? Because America chose to celebrate the white man and erase the black woman. This isn't about tearing down Amelia Earhart or Charles Lindbergh. This is about asking why their achievements were celebrated while Bessie Coleman's were buried. This is about recognizing that the erasure was deliberate, that publishers and educators and museum curators and media producers made choices. They chose to center whiteness and marginalize blackness. They chose to tell a version of aviation history that was mostly white. And they did it so effectively that 70 years passed before most Americans even heard Bessie Coleman's name. That's not just forgetting. That's erasure. That's cultural genocide. That's taking a hero, a pioneer, a trailblazer, and deleting her from the historical record so that future generations never know she existed, so that black children never see themselves in aviation history, so that white children never have to ask uncomfortable questions about why Bessie Coleman had to go to France to learn what white Americans learned at home. The cover-up was systematic. The erasure was deliberate. And it worked. For 70 years it worked. And even now in 2025, when Bessie Coleman is finally being recognized, she's still not getting the level of honor and celebration she deserves. There's no federal holiday for Bessie Coleman. There's no Bessie Coleman Airport. There's no major Hollywood movie about her life. She gets a paragraph in a textbook and maybe a small exhibit in a museum, and we're supposed to think that's enough. It's not enough. It will never be enough. Because what was taken from Bessie Coleman, and from every black aviator who came after her, and from every black family that might have built wealth through aviation careers, can never be fully restored. You can add her to textbooks now. You can name a street after her. You can put up a statue. But you can't give her back the 34 years she didn't get to live. You can't give her back the flight school she never got to open. You can't give black families back the generational wealth they would have built if aviation had been open to them from the beginning. The theft is permanent. The damage is done. And all we can do now is tell the truth. Make sure everyone knows her name. Make sure every child learns her story. Make sure the next generation doesn't grow up with the same lies we were told. That's not full justice, but it's a start.